Well, good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Barry Jones with SP History, continuing the series Treasonous Cabal. We were talking about the formation of the deep state. In part one, the first 25 chapters of this series, we covered the formation of the deep state, starting back with the end of the Civil War, continuing through the end of World War II. And in part two, my goal is my objectives are to uh, tie all of the deep state into a lot of the treasonous activities that were taking place in the United States in the 60s and the 70s. And of course, if I'm going to do this successfully, I have to show or demonstrate that, first of all, I've got to establish that there is a deep state. I hope part one did that. Secondly, I have to establish that this deep state is capable of treason, not just treachery. And I hope in part one, I established the transition from treachery into treason, starting with uh, this deep state, which of course was not called the deep state then, and still to this day, many people don't call it the deep state. They don't want to acknowledge that it even exists. So it went by lots of different names, like the robber barons, or the captains of industry, or the power elites, or the uh, collaborators during the interwar period. It didn't become uh, something we referred to as the deep state until World War II was ending and the Cold War was beginning. And so we have that, but we've seen the transition from treachery, where this deep state acting on behalf of its corporate overlords, which of course, this is a very important facet of the deep state, is its merging of the private public sectors, where the private sector operated under an operating principle called ultra vires and didn't care about public interest. It was only about profits. And as such, would immunize itself from any and all liability, allowing for it to basically do anything because it was completely uh, uh, immunized from any sort of repercussions, any sort of consequences for their actions. And so very quickly, in the pursuit of profits, these deep staters began committing treason against the United States, betraying us into wars, for example, like the Spanish-American War, like World War One, like World War Two. Um, but they also committed an act of treason, or attempted to, by trying to overthrow President Roosevelt in the business plot. We covered that as well. Um, but in part two, that's all in part one. But in part two, I am going to show how treason becomes its new standard operating procedure. Its old operating principle was ultra vires. And uh, you could almost make an argument that treason was, if you were looking their lenses, that treason was necessary to get us into World War One, for example. Somebody had to protect our ally, England. And so if it requires a little bit of treason to accomplish that objective, it's worth it. World War II, somebody had to stop Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese. So if it requires a little bit of treason to get us in that war, for the overall objective, it was worth it. And what we're going to see in part two is uh, a journey into treasonous activities merely for personal gain, merely for personal profit, merely for uh, advantages that it would afford us as a country, but more specifically, these big company heads, these big corporations. It's all about the bottom line. And so treason becomes the new operating, sort of like the standard operating procedure in the 50s and in the 60s and even into the 70s, and continues to this day. And they found a template that worked. They found an avenue to pursue, or a pattern to follow that always worked. And so that's what we're going to be looking at. My objective in part two is beyond showing that the deep state exists, beyond showing that they're capable of treason, I want to demonstrate that they're capable of and indeed guilty of treason here at home, not just abroad. You know, World War I was abroad, World War II was abroad. Uh, but this is going to happen here at home. These are going to be domestic, not all of them, but I want to show that they're capable of it and that indeed they have done it in the past. And this is to inform us going forward as we observe current events going on around us and wondering who's behind all these things, who's doing it, and why. If we know the past, it can inform the future, right? We can be wise like serpents, understanding what's going on, who's behind the scenes pulling the string, who's the patsy, who's the diversion, who's the one they want us to look at, but who's the real culprit. So that's my objective in this whole series, part one and part two, is to demonstrate, talk about the formation of the deep state first and foremost, to establish that there is a deep state, to talk about the merging of private and public interest, this ultra vires doctrine into the public sphere, which eliminated this necessity of government to act in the public interest. All of a sudden, they don't have to; they're free of that. And then to talk about the transition from treachery into treason. Once you establish the fact that this deep state exists and is capable of treason and doesn't care about the public interest, once you establish that, it changes the way you view history in the past, also changes how you view what's going on around you today. And that's the objective. So what I'm going to be doing in one of the next few episodes is talking about in this last episode, we talked about the formation of CIA and how Harry Truman signed it into law in 1947. And he was either unaware of the classified part of the document of the law, which created the covert operations capability of the CIA, or he was aware and just didn't realize to what ends they were willing to go. Nevertheless, by the time we get to 63, or 16 years later, now he's a private citizen. He's living in Independence, Missouri, or somewhere, I think it was Independence. And this is 1 month, 30 days after the assassination of JFK, he pens an op-ed to the Washington Post where he basically regrets signing this CIA into existence, especially its covert capabilities. And it's almost like he's realizing too late that he's been snookered or that he was unaware, whichever scenario it might be. But he is very much against its uh, foreign policy making power, which he says is causing all kinds of problems around the world. Now, I don't believe it's a coincidence he wrote that 30 days after the assassination of JFK. I think that's intentional because he's realized that the covert operations capabilities of the CIA, fingerprints are all over the JFK assassination. And he's alarmed, sufficiently alarmed as a former president who's quietly retired to re-engage into the public discussion about the CIA and its covert operations capabilities. He's reinserting himself into the public square. And of course, it alarmed the CIA sufficiently so that Alan Dulles made a trip out to, by the time this is written, he's not even the head of the CIA anymore. He's been fired by Kennedy. But he is the ex post de facto head. He's still running things. So he goes out to Independence to talk to Harry Truman, try to get him to change his mind and retract his statement. He was afraid of the attention it would draw to the CIA. And of course, Truman it's not just the JFK assassination. You're going to see as we go through these. He's watched a long line of covert operations take place in the 50s. And he's developed an awareness of what they're up to. And he doesn't like it. Unfortunately for him, his signature is on the law that created it. And so either it's disingenuous, like the Eisenhower warning of the deep state, the military industrial congressional complex, how disingenuous that warning was. Or it shows a lack of awareness. I don't know which, but at least 16 years later, he's trying to warn us of what's happening. So here we are, and let's talk about these covert operations that Truman is talking about in 63 in an op-ed in December that have been taking place, uh, some of them on his watch because he was still president till 40, until 52, uh, and most of them, though, on Eisenhower's watch between 52 and 60, which, if you remember now, according to the 5412 Committee and the classified part of the bill that created the CIA, that classified subcommittee, 5412, was headed by whoever was the vice president. And from 52 to 60, that was Richard Nixon. And then we get into 60, it becomes Lyndon Johnson. You can't get any more sinister characters to run a subcommittee that's in charge of all the covert operations of the CIA than Richard Nixon and Lyndon Baines Johnson. You can't find any more sinister characters than those two. All right. Anyway, in 1946, a year after the war ends, we embark upon a covert operation uh, overseen by the CIA and other departments, like the State Department was very much involved in this. Um, FBI was involved in this, and it's called Operation Paperclip. This is basically an extension of Alan Dulles' Operation Sunrise. And if you remember that story, that was before the war ended, whereby he is immunizing Nazis, German generals who are Nazis. They're going to be probably prosecuted at Nuremberg for war crimes. But they serve a dual purpose to guys like Alan Dulles and his brother John Foster, in that they have enough authority and a jurisdiction over areas of Europe whereby these United States corporations have assets, and those assets are at risk of being destroyed at the conclusion of the war, or at least being found out, publicized, that all the while we've been fighting the Germans, American business owners have been doing business with the enemy, aiding and abetting. That's treason. They very much wanted that hidden from the public, and they very much wanted their assets uh, protected. And so they contacted their lawyer from Sullivan and Cromwell, who's wearing a dual hat, right? He's got two hats. He's the Swiss director of U.S. intelligence in Europe, overseeing all of this. His name is Alan Dulles, but he also still represents all his clients back at Sullivan and Cromwell, include all these U.S. corporations that have been doing all this business with the enemy. Anyway, long story short, we talked about this at length. He immunizes these by negotiating a secret surrender with each and every one of them, and then sneaks them out of Europe through rat lines, kind of like an underground railroad, to safe harbor wherever that might be. A lot of them ended up here in America. A lot of them ended up helping us in the new Cold War against the Soviets as intelligence assets. Anyway, the point is, instead of going to Nuremberg and being tried as a war criminal, which is what they were, they got exempted from that if they were strategically placed so as to help Alan Dulles help his clients back home protect the assets and protect their identities, keep it all secret. And so it was a successful operation. It worked. They didn't get tried at Nuremberg. They did protect his clients' assets. They helped protect their identities. And we didn't find out about any of this till decades later, but it's too late to do anything about it. And so Operation Paperclip is going to be an extension of that, not just sneaking out generals who can be assets to intelligence down the road, generals who can help protect assets of big corporate heads back in America. This is an intelligence operation, again, run by Alan Dulles, to bring former Nazi scientists and doctors and engineers and technicians back to the United States. These are guys who, like, for example, the doctors who tortured Jewish prisoners under the guise of medical experiments. One of the reasons why the Nazis had the premier medical expert as far as medical knowledge was concerned at that time in the world is because they didn't have any compunction. They didn't have any problem conducting experiments on live human beings. They didn't consider Jews to even be humans. They were like animals to them. And so here they have all of these thousands upon millions, actually, of test subjects sitting in these concentration camps, waiting to be used by these Nazi doctors, while the Americans are conducting experiments on pigs and cows and trying to transfer that over to how it would relate to humans. They're actually conducting experiments on humans. And so, as far as uh, the medical expertise in the world was concerned in the 40s, the Nazis were at the head of the class. And so Dulles is looking at how these doctors and of course other scientists, engineers, technicians, etc., could help Americans uh, in the race against the Soviets to industrialize, to build, to go get into space. We were trying to build rockets. Nobody had better rockets than the Germans. In fact, we were finding big storehouses full of them that they didn't even shoot up, but they could have unmanned rockets that could deliver a payload, a weapon of some sort. We're trying to figure out, well, that would make a nice weapon for us, number one. But number two, if we're ever going to get into space, we're going to have rocket technology. And the Soviets were ahead of us at the rocket technology. They beat us into space with Sputnik and et cetera. But we're trying to catch up. So we need these German scientists who can provide the rocket technology. We need this medical expertise that these German doctors have. Uh, the German engineering was considered to be the top engineering, and it still is. Watch a Mercedes-Benz commercial. How's it go? Engineered like no other. And German engineering has always been top notch. So it's a brain drain. We're trying to steal the brains from this collapsing empire, this Third Reich, this Nazi empire. It doesn't matter what they've done. It doesn't matter that they are war criminals, many of them. It doesn't matter that they were involved in the Holocaust, the greatest uh, man-caused uh, human uh, crisis, a crisis of humanity in the history of the world. It doesn't matter. They're not going to be tried for. They're not going to be. There's not going to be any justice. They can, if they can provide any sort of service to us in this new war against the Soviets. Alan Dulles is going to sneak them to America, and they're going to be spread out across the country to help our space program. They're going to end up in places like Houston, uh, Florida, Huntsville, Alabama, where the space program was. They're going to be in hospitals and clinics across the country. They're going to be in Washington. He's already snuck out intelligence assets. They're going to be in Washington helping the CIA. They're going to be in Berlin. They're going to be everywhere we need them to be to help us going forward. And the whole goal of this program was to gain an advantage over the Soviets in the Cold War. The the space race was going to be the new frontier that was going to pit us against the Soviets. And of course, we're feeling a little panicky as we get into the 50s because they're ahead of us. The ABC weapons technology, with the Germans mastered. A stands for atomic, B was biological, and C was chemical. They were masters at that. And so we wanted to be masters at that. And just like uh, the Russians will steal, the Soviets will steal our technology to catch up with them. Atomic weapons and hydrogen bombs and eventually nuclear weapons. We're essentially doing the same. We're stealing them from the Germans, trying to catch up or trying to gain an advantage, medical research, et cetera, et cetera. So again, you can see ultravires here. It's now fully immersed in the public sector. Uh, the goal here is not to make money necessarily, make profit. It's to benefit, whatever, maximize the benefit to the United States. And public interest does not factor into these decisions of this operation at all. The public interest would be to hold all these former Nazi scientists, engineers, technicians, and doctors, these war criminals, hold them accountable for their war crimes at Nuremberg, make an example of them so it never happens again. But instead, we exempted them from it, immunized them, because that's the third part of ultravirus, which is immunity from any sort of liability. So Dulles, who has mastered this art in Operation Sunrise, just reboots it in Operation Paperclip. It's called Operation Paperclip because as these people were being snuck into the United States, here you see a picture, a portion of these folks. These are all former war criminals that should have been tried at Nuremberg. These are Nazis that come to the United States. And their file, as they were being processed by the State Department and all of the personnel involved, not everybody in the State Department is in on the secret. They don't know, but a lot of them are. And the files of these recruits would have a paperclip attached to them. And that's how they would know these go in a different stack from all the others. They get special consideration, special permissions. And the paperclip was the clue. So they call it Operation Paper. Annie Jacobson's written a really good book about it. I put the cover here so you can see it if you ever want to check it out. But there's many books on Operation Paperclip. It's widely known. Um, and it's very well documented, but that's probably the best book I've ever read on it. And just to show you how mainstreamed these scientists, these former Nazis became, here's a picture top right of two presidents, one current and another future president. You see John F. Kennedy sit there right in the middle. And then two seats over to his left is LBJ, the president after. And several of these NASA engineers and folks in charge of the NASA space program that are in this crowd are some of these former Nazis. And here they are commingling with the president, current president, and future president of the United States. And honestly, um, NASA would not have been possible without, at least not at the beginning of Kennedy's term. Of course, you remember Kennedy's the one who said, by the end of this decade, we're going to have a man on the moon. This is only possible with the introduction of these uh, German scientists. Werner von Braun, for example, sitting right there front and center with these two presidents. And he was thick as thieves with the Nazis, and now he's thick as thieves with the Americans helping run the space program. And so, uh, anyway, that's in 46. Again, remember, ultravirus, maximize benefit. Don't worry about the public interest. Immunize everybody from liability. Here you see, we've seen it over and over again in the private sector, where these companies were maximizing their profits at the expense of their workers, at the expense of the public. They didn't really care what the public interest was. And then the ultravirus law immunized them and everybody involved in the company, from the board of directors, the CEO, the owner, everybody, from any sort of liability. We've seen that in the private sector. And then we saw evidences of the merging of the private and public sector when Woodrow Wilson invited all these company heads in to run the World War effort. And then when FDR did it again, now that ultravirus doctor is fully enmeshed within the public sector. And it's now standard operating procedure, whether you're in the private sector or the public sector. And the public is way down the list of things to be considered in all of these kinds of decisions. All right, so that's one of the covert ops. Another one happened over a period of time in Italy, and I put the time span. It began in 48, so this is right. It's an election year when Harry Truman famously runs for re-election. And, you know, and then it goes all the way to 63, which is the year JFK was killed. And it involves Italy. April 17th, 1948, there was an election, and the CIA backed a party in Italy called the Christian Democrats. They were running against the Italian pro-communist socialists. Now remember now, all of these covert ops are green lighted under the guise of fighting the spread of communism. So in 1948, the CIA determined Italy was an important investment of our time, money, and our expertise in trying to prevent uh, the Socialist Party from winning that election in 1948. So we backed the Christian Democrats. And then for the next, you can see how many years there, 15 years, the CIA propped up that party. It essentially the CIA is running Italy because the Christian Democrats would not have won the election in 48 and certainly would not have continued in power for the next 15 years without the support of the CIA. So for $5 million a year, the CIA funded that party and made sure that every time there was an election, they uh, supported the Christian Democrats covertly to make sure that the Italian people voted for the Christian Democrats. So essentially what that means is that the CIA is a client state for all intents and purposes of the United States. And it is literally being run by our Central Intelligence Agency. And the reason I bring this up, and this is an important distinction or an important note to make, is that Kennedy, early in his administration in the 60s, is going to try to stop this and give the power of government back to the people of Italy. And that's going to create uh, a problem for him with the CIA because the CIA is fully invested, and has been fully invested in running Italy for the last 15 years. Who is this new president, this snot-nosed young president, inexperienced guy coming in trying to pull the rug out from this operation that has been so successful for over a decade? But we'll get to that. So that is a long-running operation. Another operation involving psychological warfare is going to take place in North Korea. It's called Operation Bluebird. And this is where these Nazi scientists will come in handy on the B and C part of their ABC warfare. B, biological, C, chemical. And we're going to give North Korean PO. This is during the war in Korea, the Korean War. And there's it's cause for alarm that some of our POWs have been used by the North Koreans as propaganda propaganda assets. Uh, we suspected they were tortured or doped up on some kind of drug, and then they would be put in front of the cameras and they would denounce America's involvement in the Korean War, and that would be played around the world. And it was demoralizing to the American people to see their own soldiers coming out against our own war effort in Korea and attempting to stop the spread of communism. And this was seen as an effective tactic by the North Koreans to uh, propagandize the American people. And they were using, at the very least, they were using torture, but we suspected that they were using uh, psychedelic drugs and different things. And so we thought we needed to have a counteract to that. So we launched Operation Bluebird, whereby these Nazi scientists were employed to conduct some of the same experiments they used to conduct on Jews in concentration camps only a couple years prior when World War II was going on. Now they're conducting these hypnosis experiments on North Korean POWs. So if you're going to do that to our POWs, we're going to do this to your POWs. And the prisoners were given high doses of amphetamines and barbiturates. And the goal was to see if we could, through the application of these drugs, combined with hypnosis, get them to do or say things against their wills during interrogation or in subsequent operations, maybe put in front of TV cameras like they're doing to ours, or maybe even subsequent to being set free, operating as a sort of a automaton, you know, doing our bidding uh, without them even realizing it, thinking that they're free, and going back into their side, doing our bidding for us as saboteurs or something of that sort. This is the predecessor to a more famous project called Project MKUltra, which we'll get into later. But uh, it's all about mind control. And the goal of Operation Bluebird was to create these unthinking robots who would do our bidding and then not have any memory of it afterwards, and not be able to assign blame where it goes. Just it's like you hardwire into the hard drive, their brain, certain actions you want them to carry out or certain things you want them to say or whatever. And then when it's over, you wipe the slate clean. And because of these drugs and hypnosis, they don't even remember it. There's a triggering mechanism that causes it all to happen. But then there's another triggering mechanism which causes it to end and the memory to be wiped clean. Anyway, this is the beginning of psych warfare as we now know it. It started in North Korea. It was handy for a couple of reasons. Number one, we had the scientists who had already been experimenting with this. In fact, when we later conduct this program back here in America called MK Ultra, we keep the same name that these Nazis used to call their program back in Nazi Germany. That's why it's MK Ultra. M stands for mind, K stands for control. That's the German spelling of control. Of course, we all know that if it was the English spelling of control, it would be MC Ultra. But because the Nazis called it MK, mind control, we kept the same initials, MK. It's straight out of Nazi Germany. And then we added ultra to it because Alan Dulles said this is the most sophisticated weapon. If we can develop this, if we can refine this and it become something that's realistic, something that we can is operational, it is the most advanced, sophisticated, it is the ultra weapon. It's the weapon of especially if you're in the CIA, you know, because you're essentially controlling people's actions and words, etc., through controlling their brain. And you're doing it through drugs, a combination of drugs and hypnosis. So Dulles was heavily involved in this, heavily invested in this, because he could see the potential. If you've ever seen any of the Bourne Identity, the Jason Bourne movies, they're loosely based on this whole project, where you create an assassin who is under the control of his handlers, and they send him out. He's hypnotized and he's drugged up. He's got this regimen of drugs that he's on constantly, and they can basically push buttons and tell him what to do. And he's he's highly trained. He so he can fight. He can extricate himself from just about any situation. He is uh, feels no pain or fear or anything. He's an automaton, and he's under the control of his handlers back in Langley, and they're just push button telling him, "Okay, go assassinate this guy, go assassinate that guy," and it's like a machine. And of course, that machine can malfunction, and the whole point of that movie series, is that the main character, Jason Bourne, which is his alias, um, begins to remember things about his past, and it doesn't reconcile with what he's doing now. And he's having a crisis of conscience. He's trying to piece together his past, remember how he got to be this hired assassin. And in other words, he's a malfunctioning asset. So then the CIA at some point makes a decision. They got to put him down because he jeopardizes the entire program. So throughout that whole series, he's trying to stay one step ahead of the agency and stay alive. Meanwhile, exposing this program. So this is Operation Bluebird. And the other reason why this is handy, in addition to the fact that we have these Nazi scientists at our disposal who've been doing this for years in Germany. So we have a big leg up in pursuing this operation because they've been experimenting on real live human beings for so many years doing it. The second advantage we have is the fact that we're in a war. We have foreign combatants or non-combatants, whomever we consider them to be, whoever the POWs are, that we can experiment on. We don't have to experiment on our own people. We can experiment on the North Koreans, just like they are allegedly experimenting on ours. So we have a handy pool of, just like the Germans did during World War II when they used the Jews. We now have, and of course, I am sure that this is part of the influence of these German scientists saying, hey, we need humans to experiment on. We don't need to be experimenting on pigs, you know. So here we're in this war. We have POWs. So uh, there's your pool of uh, people your testing pool, so to speak. So that is, and of course, because it continues on later after the war is over and comes home and under a new name, MK Ultra, that indicates that Operation Bluebird was successful enough, at least, to warrant a continuation of that program. Then we get into the situation in Iran in 1953, Operation Ajax. This is a CIA-backed Iran coup because the leader, the democratically elected leader of Iran, Mossadegh, uh, is trying to nationalize all the resources in Iran to keep these resources for the Iranian people. And there are U.S. companies who don't want to see that happen, specifically with regards to its primary asset, which is oil. And so this is where you see the merging of corporate interests with state actors, and in this case, the CIA, and of course, backed by the U.S. military. This is all at the behest of these U.S. corporations who want to keep their mitts on this oil. But Mossadegh has become a problem. And so the CIA backs a coup. A coup is a violent overthrow of the government, whereby he is violently evicted from office. You can see top right-hand picture there as he is under arrest. And you can see in the top left there, this is an article in the New York Times showing that Mossadegh in Iran is being viewed almost as a messiah because he's trying to protect Iranian oil from these foreign, uh, these robber barons who want to come in and take the oil. And so you see that bottom document there where a campaign to install a pro-Western government in Iran. And you see the target. The target is Prime Minister Mossadegh and his government. The objectives through legal or quasi-legal, which basically means illegal, methods to effect the fall of Mossadegh government and to replace it with a pro-Western government under the Shah's lead. We picked a guy who was educated in America, so he's Westernized, and we're going to set him up to replace. His name is Pahlavi, and he's going to be installed as the Shah of Iran instead of Mossadegh. And his first official action now, as he is essentially being just like Italy, just like the CIA backed the Christian Democrats and the government there for 15 years ran Italy. Now the CIA is going to get rid of Mossadegh, replace him with Pahlavi. But of course, Pahlavi owes his very existence, his position as Shah to the CIA. He's going to do whatever the CIA tells him. And what does the CIA want? They want Iran's oil supply. And so instead of Mossadegh protecting Iranian oil, you now have Pahlavi handing over 40% of Iran's oil to Gulf Oil, Texaco, Mobil Oil, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of California, all these U.S. corporations that want this cheap Middle Eastern oil. So this is what we talked about with General Smedley Butler when he retired from the United States Marine Corps, and he probably realized it while it was going on, but he didn't say anything or make it public until he retired. Wrote a book about it, called it the War is a Racket. And he said, I thought I was fighting for the United States government, for the United States people, for the United States of America. Turns out I was just a gangster of capitalism. All these years I've been the Marines. They sent us all these different places around the world to uh, fight the indigenous peoples, the locals, to open up those places to American business interests. And we were the hammer. And so this is somebody on the inside uh, exposing this. Of course, it was later, but this is what's going on. That's in 53. Then we have the program I've already mentioned, and that is the continuation of the psych warfare program, which began in North Korea and now is going to continue from 1953 to 1973 in Vietnam and then later in the United States. This is called Project MKUltra. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the forerunner to MKUltra is Operation Bluebird, and we already know that all this research originated in Nazi Germany when in these concentration camps where they had Jews upon whom they could uh, conduct all these terrible, torturous experiments. And then we brought those scientists to America under Operation Paperclip. And then in the Korean War, we began Operation Bluebird, putting to work all these Nazi scientists with this new batch of human test subjects upon whom they could continue their research. The war ending sort of aborted their research. It ended their research. It ended their research pool of test subjects when concentration camps were liberated. We are essentially jump-starting that program, rebooting it, and giving them a fresh batch of test subjects during Operation Bluebird. And then when the Korean War ends, a few years later, we get involved in Vietnam, they'll reboot it again because there's another batch of fresh test subjects in Vietnam. This program, as I mentioned, was called Mind Control with a K, dead giveaway, where that comes from. That's right out of Nazi Germany. And this was approved by CIA Director Allen Dulles, and he appointed uh, Sidney Gottlieb, which is a CIA doctor, scientist, we call him the poisoner in chief, to be over this project. This is going to be a long running project, okay? And it has a lot of different fingers go off in a lot of different directions. But Allen Dulles ultimately was in control of this during these years. He signed off on it, and he put Sidney Gottlieb in charge of it. It's called the Manhattan Project of the Mind. It's that big a scope. When you think about the original Manhattan Project, you think about the project to create an atomic weapon. And we've shown how it was spread out across the country. You had part of it in Washington State, you had part of it at the University of Chicago in Illinois, you had a big research lab down in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Obviously, you have headquarters in Washington, spread out in a bunch of small communities across the country, and intentionally so, to fragment the project, to compartmentalize it so nobody knows everything that's going on, and to keep it secret. And it culminates in the end of World War II with the dropping of 2 atomic bombs in Japan. This is an equivalent project in the sense that it's spread out all over the place, and research is being conducted even overseas on this project. And but it's as important, just as important as the development of atomic weapons. That's why he called it ultra, because in Alan Dulles' view, this is the silver bullet. If we can get control of people's minds and program them like robots to do our bidding, imagine the possibilities with that. So this begins Operation Bluebird takes us to the Korean War and the years thereafter. MKUltra begins in Vietnam with a program called the Phoenix Program, whereby we are conducting the same research on the Vietnamese that we've been conducting on the Koreans that the Germans used to conduct on the Jews. It's all part of the same program. And then when the Vietnam War will eventually end, uh, it'll migrate to America, and they'll have to come up with a new batch of test subjects. And this is where we find out that the CIA is violating its charter by conducting an operation on U.S. soil. It's not the only time, but it's one of the times. And they're targeting American citizens as test subjects in this. There's some kind of disconnect in our minds that we sort of rationalize to ourselves that as long as these operations are overseas and conducted against people we're at war with, it's okay. We don't we don't really consider the humanity of or the inhumanity of these kinds of projects. It's war, right? War is hell. All is fair in love and war. After all, we only got into this because they were doing it to us first, our POWs. So we rationalize it. And we say, well, as long as it's happening to the North Koreans, or as long as it's happening to the North Vietnamese, or the whatever. But as soon as it comes home to America and starts happening on American soil to American citizens, that's a whole different set of encyclopedias. And of course, the CIA's charter was such, the law was written that it would operate only on foreign soil. It was not supposed to operate on American soil. It's very important that you understand that, because uh, if I had a nickel for every time people told me that the CIA could not have been involved in the JFK assassination or the RFK assassination because it only operates on foreign soil and that's a domestic operation, I would be a very wealthy man. There is this assumption that the CIA was abiding by all these years its charter. And we are finding out now that it never did abide by its charter. It never did follow the law. It was always operating domestically at the same time. Now, it was operating on foreign soil. We've already seen, the experiments in North Korea. We've already seen the overthrow of the government in Iran. We've already seen Operation Paperclip in Europe and Operation, Sunrise in Europe. So no question that it's operating on foreign soil. We've already seen the coup, the propagandizing of the Italian people to control the government there. It's operating on foreign soil, but it will, as we will see, as we go forward, it will, from the very inception of the CIA, be operating simultaneously on American soil using American targets. So, what is this Phoenix program? Well, the Phoenix program was human experimentation, and it required that without permission. Now, during the Vietnam War, that was handy because we had Vietnamese prisoners, POWs. And the goal was to experiment using the drugs, using the hypnosis, to bend the subject's minds to the agency's will, to get these robots to program their minds to carry out whatever operation the CIA had wanted them to carry out. And then afterwards, they'd be like zombies almost. They just kind of uh, they aren't they aren't in control of their own faculties. We could use them as saboteurs, we could use them as assassins. The important thing is they're going to do our bidding. They're going to do it whether they want to do it or not. Their own central command center has been compromised, so to speak. And now somebody else is controlling them. And then when it's all over, said and done with, they have this severe case of amnesia and they have no memory. They have no memory of it. They don't remember being drugged. They don't remember being hypnotized. They don't remember being programmed. They don't remember the act itself, whatever it is they were supposed to do. They don't remember anything. And this is, and I'm going to, as I go through these programs, I'm going to indicate, according to the CIA's own documents, a lot of this we learned from the CIA's own documents in 75 during the church hearings, where the CIA was forced to turn over what they called the family jewels. It's all their internal documents. And this is where we learn about a lot of this. And they indicated in their own documents whether this was a successful operation or whether it was an unsuccessful operation. So by their own determination, we're going to indicate whether these operations were successful or unsuccessful. Of course, we've already learned Operation Paperclip was very successful because for all decades, the Americans people never learned that we immunized all these Nazi war criminals, brought them to America, helped get our rockets to the moon, helped create this Operation Bluebird, which turns into MKUltra program, the psychological warfare, helped create all this, uh, helped bring all this medical expertise to America, straight out of these torture chambers and these concentration camps. So you'd have to say, for what Alan Dulles was trying to achieve, Operation uh, Paperclip was extremely successful. American people didn't find out about it till decades later. You'd have to say that its control of the Italian government for 15, 16 years was incredibly successful for the period, for the amount of money that they spent and the amount of control that they had. $5 million, not very much money. But for 15, 16 years, they essentially ran Italy. So you have to say that was very successful. You'd have to say that obviously Operation Bluebird was very successful because it became MK Ultra. And MK Ultra, for what they were trying to achieve, was very successful. Now, once the American people learn of it, it becomes a big embarrassment, something to be hidden. But they're not going to get rid of the research value, what they learned. And what they learned gave them, uh, it gave them an intelligence bonanza, or as far as understanding how the human mind works and how it easily the human mind can be controlled. It was extremely successful operation. Uh, the overthrow of Iran's government, installation of Pahlavi as the new Shah, an extremely successful operation. Just ask the oil companies. So far, what we're seeing is a string of successes. Again, the public interest doesn't matter in any of these. We don't care about these POWs. According, especially in the Phoenix program, when we get to Vietnam, we're going to find out most of them, when the experiments were over, they were so wrung out and so destroyed mentally and physically, they had to be killed. And so they were just treated like spendable objects. And so we didn't care about the public interest at all. Humanity doesn't factor into this at all. It's all about the maximum benefit it could provide. And of course, we're going to find out too, when all these CIA operations, even when we learn about them through the church hearings, there's no repercussions to any of these CIA personnel who took part in any of these things. There's no uh, criminal trials, nothing. Nobody lost their jobs, nothing. So they immunized themselves. There's ultravirus. Maximize the benefit to us. Don't worry about public interest. Don't worry about humanity. And then immunize yourself so that there's no repercussions. When the American people do finally find out 20 years later, 30 years later, 40 years later, whatever, we're all dead and gone or retired. It's been so long, there's not going to be a trouble. We get away with it. And that's ultravirus. So this project, as you can see some of the paperwork here, Washington Post headline, panel finds that the CIA broke the law. CIA infiltrated 17 area groups, gave out LSD. This is all, and you can see the year. I'm circling it with my cursor up there. It's the mid set. Let's say it says 1973 up there. This is when we're finding this all out. You can see too that this program ended in 73. So when we found out, when it became public, the program had to be scuttled. It was so controversial. But for 20 years, we didn't know anything about it. This CIA Phoenix program operating under, as part of this MK Ultra, and the reason it, it was taking place in Vietnam was because again we have a batch of POWs or people prisoners we can conduct these experiments on, and it's so far away from American people, away from prying eyes, away from the media attention that you know you can do it and keep it a secret. So it targeted mostly non-combatants, where we would go into these villages whom we suspected of collaborating with the National Liberation Front, the North Korea or the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, whatever. If even if they weren't collaborating, but they were afraid to say anything because of what might happen to them from the Viet Cong or the NLF, we would torture them. We would capture them, round them up. We would say that they were collaborators, and then we would torture them with this program, assortment of drugs and torture tactics and hypnosis, etc. This whole program was headed by CIA officers Ted Shackley and David Morales. Now, I bring up those names because you're going to see those names again when we get to 63. Ted Shackley eventually becomes the head of the base down in Miami, which is essentially headquarters for all the anti-Castro stuff, but it's also headquarters, David, to an assassination program. That's two programs. One's running against foreign heads of state, and one super secret is running against American targets. It's all being run out of Miami, and Ted Shackley's in control of it. And David Morales is one of the CIA's most notorious assassins, who, according to witnesses, ends up 63 in Dallas on the day JFK was killed, ironically, right? So they're in charge of this operation. It took place at Bien Ho Prison in Saigon, and they used torture, massive doses of LSD, which is a new drug. By the way, all the LSD manufactured for the purposes of this program. And so later on, when LSD gets introduced into American society, since the only supply of LSD belonged to the CIA during this period of time, the introduction of it into American society is the direct result of the CIA introducing it into American society because they controlled the supply of it. This becomes apparent when we get into the operation out in San Francisco with the hippies, Charles Manson, all that kind of stuff. That LSD came from the CIA, and all those people, all those hippies that were involved, taking LSD, that was all under the auspices of the CIA. When they ran out of Vietnam subjects, as the Vietnam War ended, the operation came home, and now the LSD needs to be integrated into American society on certain American target populations for the same purposes, for the purposes of research. It's pretty scandalous stuff. Anyway, other drugs, sometimes they would remove parts of people's skulls and implant electrodes in their brains, knowing full well that this was going to be fatal, this was going to kill these people. It didn't matter. That wasn't the point. In the end, according to the CIA's own documents, 40,000 South Vietnamese. And these are non-combatants. These are people that were just alleged to have been collaborators. Now, you could be a collaborator with the NLF if you just didn't share what you know, or if you didn't uh, tell the Americans when they came through what they wanted to know. It it's very subjective how you could be categorized as a collaborator. You're just trying to mind your own business, grow food for your family, stay out of this war that's killing both sides. You're trying to keep in the middle and not make yourself a victim. But we wouldn't allow them to not choose a side. If they would not choose to help us, we labeled them as collaborators and killed 40. This is why we lost popular support for the war, because we're killing as many. We're essential. We're supposed to be fighting on the behalf of the South Vietnamese, but instead, if they don't help us enough in order to strike fear into them and force them to, essentially what we're trying to do is make these South Vietnamese people fear us more than they did the Viet Cong or the NLF. And so it's a race to the bottom. It's a race to inhumanity, so to speak, a race to hell. And we killed 40,000 South Vietnamese, basically peasants. The CIA killed 40,000 of these people in these experiments taking place at this prison under the auspices of research, using these same Nazi scientists and doctors who had conducted the same research years earlier in all these concentration camps scattered out across Europe, and later conducted the research in Korea, and now later are conducting the same research in Vietnam. It's the same people, it's the same program, it's the same kind of research. It's a continuation of the same research. And you can see here, I've just uh, grabbed some random documents here. These are documents that we got access to in church hearings. Uh, Now, when the Vietnam War ends, remember Nixon promised when he won election in 68, he was going to negotiate an end to the Vietnam War. And, he wins in 68. 72, he finally does, right before his reelect. So for the last year of the program, they had to bring the program home. And now they're looking for test subjects. They don't have Jews from concentration camps. They don't have North Korean POWs. They don't have all these uh, South Vietnamese non-combatants, these peasants. So now they spread this. This is where the Manhattan Project idea comparison comes in. They spread it out to 44 different colleges and universities across the country. Some of these are the most premier research institutions in our country, even to this day, such as Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, 15 research foundations like Rockefeller, right? Ford Foundation, chemical or pharmaceutical companies involved producing the chemicals that would be needed, LSD mainly, for these experiments. And then 12 hospitals or clinics, and then 3 prisons. And they all work together in this conspiracy against American citizens on American soil. The CIA is conducting MKUltra mind experiments against its own people. And so, uh, there's a lot of people with blood on their hands as a result of this program. I give you a couple instances of people, and some of the victims. These are American victims of this program. One was James Whitey Bulger. We know Bulger as being this notorious violent criminal out of Boston area, worked with the mob and stuff. And turns out when he was originally arrested and went to Alcatraz, you can see that down there to the bottom left, he was considered a petty criminal at that time, nonviolent. All of his crimes were nonviolent. Uh, Theft, auto theft, just rinky-dink kind of stuff. And he became part of this program. It's a long story, but there's documents to show, and of course, some pretty good books been written about it. But there's to show that during his time at Alcatraz, he was he was used in this program as a test subject, and when he emerged, he became a very violent criminal. And suspicion was for many, many years he remained at large. He was committing all these heinous crimes, and he was never arrested for it. And it turns out that he was an informant, so to speak, for the FBI during the same time he was committing all these terrible crimes. And the transition for him, or the line of demarcation, was his incarceration at Alcatraz, before which he was a nonviolent criminal. Then he goes through this terrible experiment program, mind control program. He becomes a violent criminal afterwards, but they won't arrest him. They won't incarcerate him. They won't take him off the streets because he's providing information from his underworld, so to speak, to the FBI, and he's an asset during this period of time. And eventually, when the program got exposed, he had, they had to round him up in addition to others. But he was one of the victims of this program. They they broke his brain, and he becomes this violent guy, whereas before he wasn't violent. Here's a partial list of some of the other victims. Best book I could recommend on this topic is the book called Chaos. I've got it right there in the center, written by Tom O'Neill. It's relatively recent. I think it's been written within the last 4 or 5 years. Tom O'Neill got into the study of this just to do an article or a piece on Charles Manson. And in his research to Charles Manson, he discovered that Manson was part of a long string of victims of this MK Ultra program that included Jack Ruby, Sirhan, Ted Kaczynski. Talk about Ted Kaczynski here in a minute. All of whom became notorious criminals, locked away, throw away the key kind of people. But they became that only after they were subjected to this research that broke their brain. In Jack Ruby's case, um, it was a cover up. It was in order to cover up what he knew. Jack Ruby was found guilty of murder, of executing or assassinating Lee Harvey Oswald. We all know that story. It was on television. We saw it happen, and he was condemned to be executed in Texas. Well, on appeal, the sentence was thrown out, and he was ordered to have a new trial. And the judge, in his first trial, Jack Ruby hadn't said anything. He had been assigned a mob attorney, and they basically pled him guilty and kept him quiet, which was all part of the plan. But in the second trial, he was told by the judge, if I'm going to grant this appeal, you have to talk in the second trial. And he ends up dying like within 30 days of being diagnosed with cancer. He ends up dying of cancer right there in jail, right after that he's given his he won his appeal. But before all that happened, the Warren Commission, which was studying the JFK assassination, went to Dallas to interview the most famous witness in the case, and that was Jack Ruby. But before they went, Alan Dulles assigned one of these MK Ultra. Remember, now he was in charge of MK Ultra, and Alan Dulles was in charge. Essentially, he was the number 2 guy in the Warren Commission, and he knew that the Warren Commission was going to interview Jack Ruby, and he didn't know what Jack Ruby was going to say. And so, in order to make sure that Jack Ruby didn't say anything, or that his testimony couldn't be used to implicate the CIA in any way, shape, or form in the assassination of JFK, he ordered Jolly West, who was one of the primary doctors in the MK Ultra program, who had just successfully completed research and written an article about how he had successfully been able to create memory loss in his patients. And he sent he'd also written about how he'd been able to create temporary insanity in his patients. The key word there being temporary, whereby for the purposes of whatever the CIA might want, they would appear to be insane, and then later they would come out of it. But for the period that it was important, they would appear to be insane. And he'd written a lot. This is all documented. He wrote, he published articles on it, and he was assigned to go visit Jack Ruby in prison before the Warren Commission came down to interview him. And during the time that Jolly West visited Jack Ruby, and of course, there were no cameras, there were no witnesses. It was just Jolly West and Jack Ruby alone in a cell. And when Jolly West emerged from the cell afterwards, he announced to the media that Jack Ruby had had a psychotic break with reality during the interview and that he was useless as a witness in the JFK assassination because he'd lost his mind. And so when the Warren Commission went down to interview Jack Ruby, he was a babbling idiot. He was talking about, Jewish children being butchered, and he was hiding under the table, banging his head against the wall. And the Warren Commission famously emerged after interviewing Jack Ruby from the jail cell, and Chief Justice Earl Warren announced to the media that there is no value in any of the testimony from this witness. And that was the whole point of this little scenario that Alan Dulles set up with Jolly West. He sent his MKUltra doctor to meet with Ruby before the Warren Commission went to assure that Jack Ruby would become a babbling idiot. He sent the guy who published an article saying he had just successfully figured out how and tested it, how to create temporary insanity in his subjects. He sent that guy to meet with Jack Ruby before Jack Ruby met with the Warren Commission so that Jack Ruby could not tell the truth about what he knew, even if he wanted to. And then later, when he became a loose end after he won his appeal, these same folks killed him with cancer. That's another story, but that's what happened. So Project MKUltra, Jack Ruby was most definitely a victim of Project MKUltra. He's a notorious guy, right? How about Sirhan Sirhan? Sirhan was the alleged assassin of RFK. Now, I'm not going to go into all the story, but just a snapshot. Sirhan did fire at RFK when he came into that pantry. There's a picture of him there on the left. He was standing in front. He was always standing in front of RFK, never to the side, never to the back, always in front facing him. And all the witnesses saw him shooting. And of course, they attacked him, his arm, and he started shooting bullets. None of his bullets made contact with RFK with his head, killed him. They were sprayed all over. According to the autopsy, RFK was killed by a shot behind his right ear that was so close he had powder burns on his skin. There was only one person that could be, and that was Thane Eugene Caesar, who was acting as his security guy, escorting him into that pantry. And witnesses said they saw Thane Eugene Caesar with his gun pulled. That never came up at trial. Sirhan, meanwhile, was arrested, and he seemed to have superhuman strength. He was a small little fella. It took everybody in there to hold him down. He had superhuman strength. And then afterwards, he had no memory of anything that had happened, what he had allegedly done, why he did it. He had no idea. He was just complete blank slate. He is still to this day serving a prison sentence out in California. And to this day, this happened in 68. So here we are, 32 plus 25. What's that? 32 plus 25 is 42, 52, 57 years later. He still has no memory. They keep wanting him, every time he comes up for parole, they want him to apologize, express remorse for what he did. He goes, how can I express remorse for what I did? I accept it. If you said I did it, I guess I did it. But I can't express remorse for it because I have no memory of it. And those were two of the traits of the MKUltra programmed assassin. Those are two of the traits: superhuman strength and no memory. And so there's a big suspicion that Sirhan was hypnotized by the CIA to commit that. He was one of the outcomes of this program. And of course, you'd have to say it was successful because they wanted RFK out of the way. Charles Manson is another story whereby, almost in a replay of the Whitey Bulger story, he is used or experimented on with hypnosis and all these drugs. And then given the extension of the program was to see if their test subject could then, uh, by being given the same drugs and hypnosis training that the CIA used on him, could he do it on others and create followers that would carry out his wishes? So it's like the CIA is now creating a buffer between them, plausible deniability, whereby two they're two positions removed from the actual criminal act, whereby they are now using their test subject to create a family of followers that carries out the orders that are coming from headquarters, filtered through this middleman, Charles Manson. Charles Manson's not involved in the crime. The CIA is not involved in the crime technically. It's these followers who are hypnotized and drugged up, carrying out these crimes like programmed assassins, like programmed crazy people. Uh, they're acting on the instructions of their leader, of the leader of their little family, their little unit. And of course, in that case, it was Charles Manson. Read the book. I don't have time. I did a big, I did several episodes on all of this, and different. I have different when I did in my JFK assassination series. But read the book Chaos, and it'll tell the story of Charles Manson. It's a completely different version of events and how the government always covers these things up through manipulation of the trial. And they got a mob appointed attorney to represent Jack Ruby in the first trial. They got another mob appointed attorney to represent Sirhan, who never introduced the evidence that showed that Sirhan could not have been RFK's killer. Could not have been. Not that he wasn't. He could not have been. It wasn't possible. And they all, of course, they had a district attorney in their back pocket. The LAPD was in their back top pocket, and the district attorney was in their back pocket in the Charles Manson case to get him convicted. And then you have the story of Ted Kaczynski. We know him as the Unabomber. Pictured on the right here, you see in 1958, looks like a wholesome young man. And then you see him a few years later, 1996, what he ends up looking like when he's arrested. So what's the story of Ted Kaczynski? Ted Kaczynski in 1958 was this savant, brilliant kid. He's only 15 years old. He completes high school at age 15, goes to Harvard at 16, and to this day, he's still the only student in Harvard history to get a 98.9% in a logics course taught by this famous logician, Willard Van Orman Quine, who evidently runs one of the hardest classes in Harvard, on Harvard's campus. And this kid at age 16 got a 98.9% grade in that class. He's a genius. That's what he is. He's a genius. While he was there, he was uh, funneled into by his advisor, who was on the payroll of the CIA, into a 3-year experiment as part of this MKUltra program. They wanted somebody who was exceptionally bright, and they found him, young and bright, impressionable and bright. And he just, it changed his whole life, just like Whitey Bulger. It changed his whole life. He he goes off the grid. He finishes Harvard. He goes to the University of Michigan for a while. He starts writing these manifestos where he uh, begins confronting the system, calling for. He says, "quote the system which has quote robbed contemporary humans of their autonomy, forcing them to behave in ways that are increasingly remote from the natural pattern of human behavior." He's writing from personal experience. He's undergone this 3-year program at Harvard, and they broke his brain, but he is still at when you get down to the nub of it, he's still this brilliant guy. And so in his fight against the system, he goes off the grid, builds this little cabin up in, I don't know, I think it's in Montana or Wyoming somewhere, out in the woods. And he's just completely off the grid. He starts writing manifestos, sending them to newspapers around the country, and plan and coming up with building these by himself, building these bombs, these mail bombs, which he, between the years 1978 1995, plants about 16 of these at different public buildings. Most of these are like government buildings or public type buildings affiliated with the system. They all had a point to try to attack the system that he was so angry with. And eventually, they finally found it. You know, the famous FBI profiler tried to, you know, they all thought this was an angry blue collar guy who was mad at the system because he lost his job or whatever. And they finally had to realize, after reading enough of his manifestos, this guy's not a blue collar guy. This guy's a very well educated guy. He's a very smart guy. So they had to completely adjust their thinking about and eventually they were able to find uh, him and who was behind it, and they arrested him. I believe he's still in prison to this day. I don't think he's died. I think he's still alive, and we know him as the Unabomber. But here is another case of a guy who the CIA targeted because he was smart, because he was young and impressionable, and through the help of the advisor at Harvard, got him involved into this program, and they broke his brain and they completely ruined his life. These are just a few examples. You say, well, my God, I've never heard of it. In the mid 1970s, the CIA, when this program was exposed finally to the church hearings, the CIA had to pay families, certain families whose children had been, mainly sons who had been pulled into this program and were victims of this. They had to pay him $750,000 in damages to 9 different families who had become unwitting participants in these MK Ultra experiments. And to varying degrees, all of them, their lives were ruined. And so this is the CIA accepting responsibility. This is one case where the public found out and people put two and two together. They tried to hide all their documents. They tried to destroy them all. They didn't quite get all of them. And in 1977, in a Senate hearing, CIA psychologist John Gittinger testified that MK Ultra had been a terrible mistake. This is for public consumption, right? Privately, they learned a lot. And though they had to pay some money and accept responsibility, the CIA, that was money well spent in their view. This is why they considered this to be a successful program, because the research that was done and the expertise that they gained in being able to control people's minds. Yes, there were some victims, and that's what it got messy when they had to come home and do it here in America. When they were doing it uh, in Korea or Vietnam, nobody knew about that. Now we found out about it, but we didn't know about it in time to stop it or to prevent it or to do something about it. It came home to America in the mid 1970s. Church hearings exposed all this. They had to terminate the program and accept some responsibility for it. I'm going to stop there today because I've got a ton of these covert ops to go through, and I don't want to overwhelm you. And I think I've been getting too long with my videos. So I'm gonna stop it there. And in the next episode, we'll continue with another operation in Guatemala, basically a rerun of Iran. And what you're going to see as we go through all these, is a template that is formed, a pattern which gets repeated over and over and over again. And that's the filter that I now run all of these current events through in my mind, this pattern or this template. If I see evidence is up, for example, last summer when there was an attempted assassination on former President Trump at the time when he was campaigning in Pennsylvania, It was pretty clear really early on that the kid that was shot on the roof was Patsy because he was the diversion. And the witnesses who saw a second person on that roof or in the window, and all of the Secret Service mistakes. And you said, well, they were mistakes. Were they mistakes? Because in Dallas, they weren't mistakes. And it was an intentional uh, security stripping operation, which looked suspiciously like what happened in Butler, Pennsylvania. A security stripping whereby the target or the protectee is no longer being protected. He's wide open. And you have your Patsy, who's a young, impressionable person who's going to be right there for everybody to see. They're going to take him out so he can't talk afterwards. Meanwhile, the perpetrator gets away. And the guy who's the Patsy ends up being the diversion. And so you see that, and that filter that has been created by research of all of these CIA covert ops over the years now helps clue me in quickly as to who is behind these things, these current events. That's really what I'm trying to do is help you see uh, what has happened, what is documented to have happened, and be able to plug that knowledge in to events that are happening as we speak and see if there's any sort of correlation. Okay, that's enough for today. Thank you for listening. Please consider subscribing to my channel, smash the like button. Feel free to share these videos or this channel with anybody you think might be interested, and or comment in the comment section. Thank you. Until next time, God bless.